let's get started on the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1948 to 1996 HSC modern history topic. Now, before I start this, I just want to preface by saying a couple things about the topic that you'll need to know in the back of your mind before you actually go in and start. For this topic specifically, there are a lot of different schools of thoughts. There are a lot of different opinions on what actually happened politically, socially, during the Arab-Israeli conflict during this period. So I'm just going to explain a couple of these schools of thought before we get started so that we can really understand exactly what's going on. So the first school of thought that I want to talk about is the Zionist school of thought. Now, these guys believe that Jews have a birthright to Palestine. They really believe that, Palestine / Israel, the land is theirs. These Zionists believe that the Jews have the right to this land, and they are very heavy believers of this. So these are usually Jewish historians. These are very heavy Zionists. And if you don't remember Zionists from the year 11 course, I would highly recommend you review that before starting the year 12 course. Now, we then have Arab historians who also believe that Arabs have a birthright to Palestine / Israel, and they believe that the Arab or Palestinian people actually own this land, and so they have the right to this land. And of course, their rendition of history, both the Zionists and the Arab historians, really reflect their beliefs. And so obviously for us today, this history isn't really that valuable, although it was valuable for what we call the post-Zionists or the revisionists. Now, they sort of looked at Zionist history and Arab history and new documents which, were released to the world after the conflict, and they sort of pieced together the rendition of history that is trusted, although I can't really say this is what happened for certain. And this is the point of the modern history topic, is that you're supposed to come up with your own beliefs and your own sort of understanding of the history, and then you just need to be able to argue what you believe in an essay, remembering that historians, like current historians and the modern history topic, wants you to understand that Zionism, like that the Zionist rendition of history and the Arab rendition of history are very biased. And so the historians you want to use, although you can use Zionist historians in your essays and Arab historians in your essays, you really, really want to be using those post-Zionist historians. So now that we're over with that little rant about Zionists and Arabs and post-Zionists, let's actually get into the first dot point. So I'm just going to share my screen and to my notes, and you'll see me there in a sec. All right, so here we are at my notes, and just so you know, I've got notes off to the side as well. So if you see me looking over, that's what I'm looking at, and it's just to make sure that I'm explaining all of this to the best of my ability. So we're looking at the first dot point under the survey of this topic, and the survey only has one dot point, but it is really hefty and it has a lot of content. So we'll go through, we'll talk about it, and we'll try to make sense of all of this. So the first sort of like sub point under the survey is Israeli and Palestinian perspectives on the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. We'll then go through in the next lesson and talk about consequences of the war for Israel and Palestinians to 1967. And in the third lesson for the survey, we'll talk about political and social issues in Arab-Israeli relations in 1967. So this is sort of like under, obviously, the heading Origins of Tension. So let's start at the 1948 Arab-Israeli War perspectives. Now, let's look at background of the perspectives first, and I'm also going to go through later on and sort of give you a quick little summary about all of this, but we'll look at this for now. So, background on the 1948 war and perspectives, the birth of the Israeli state. So, on the 14th of May 1948, the British mandate was finalised, and within hours, David Ben-Gurion announced Jewish independence and proclaimed the State of Israel. Now, David Ben-Gurion was obviously British, and David Ben-Gurion is literally the Prime Minister of Israel. David Ben-Gurion is not obviously British. Within hours of the British Mandate being finalised, Ben-Gurion announced that the Jews had a state. For the first time, they had an independent state of Israel. Now, President Truman of the United States further sort of solidified this, and on the 13th of May, the day before the end of the British Mandate, he announced the American recognition of the Jewish state, and this really secured its creation. So, moving on to the outbreak of the 1948 war. The very next day after the British Mandate was finalised, there was a declaration of war issued. Armies of Syria, Egypt, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq all attacked along the borders of the Jewish state. Now, these are the Arabs. The Arabs are coming in and they are attacking the Jews, attacking the Israelis. So, the Jordanian Arab Legion, which is sort of all these armies, they crossed the Jordan River and within 14 days had occupied East Jerusalem and what today is called the West Bank. So, okay, so let's look at the perspective summary. So, just to let you know, this was actually, all of these notes were actually taken from a reading I did that was written by Avi Shleim, and it's titled The Debate About 1948. So if you guys want to search up the debate about 1948, it is much more detailed, but I've tried to sort of summarize it, and these are the exact words of Avi Shleim, so you can quote anything you want. So, most Israelis would be outraged by the suggestions that they are conquerors, yet this is how they are perceived by the Palestinians, or Palestinians are also the Arabs. There can be no agreement on what actually happened in 1948. And this is what I was talking about these, differing views. There's so many different views. And really, we can't ever know what happened, but there's a couple of theories. Anyway, moving on. Each side subscribes to a different version of events. The Palestinians regard Israelis as the conquerors and themselves as the true victims of the First Arab-Israeli War, which they call al-Nakba, or the disaster. It's also referred to as the catastrophe. Okay, so just looking over here at the Palestinians regard the Israelis, I just want to be very clear that the Palestinians, right over here, the Palestinians, they are the Arabs, and the Israelis are the Jews. And so the Palestinians obviously want an Arab state and the Israelis want a Jewish state. So just to be clear about that, because it can be a bit of a confusing concept to grasp. So in these first couple of lessons, I'm going to really point it out so it makes a lot of sense to you all. So the Israelis, on the other hand, whether conquerors or not, were the indisputable victors in the 1948 war, which means they won. They won the war. They got their state of Israel, and unfortunately, the Palestinians did not get their Arab state of Palestine. Also, the Israelis refer to the 1948 war as the War of Independence, whereas the Palestinians refer to it as the disaster, the Great Disaster, and then you've got another side of the war referring to it as the War of Independence. So you can really see those heavily differing opinions and perceptions of what happened. Now, because the Israelis were victors, this should say victors, please, this should not say victims, it is victors, like they won the war. So because the Israelis were victors in the war, they were able to propagate more effectively than their opponents their version of this fateful war. History, in a sense, is the propaganda of the victors. And so this is a really good quote from Avi Shleim, which will help you in your essays, and I would really, of all quotes, I would really highly recommend that this one right here, history in a sense is a propaganda of the victors. This is a really, really good quote that you, of course, want to be using in your essays. It's something good to remember. Okay, so now this was a sort of rough summary of the different perspectives, and now I'm going to dive into more detail about the two significant perspectives of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and also, of course, our lovely post-Zionist historians. So, Israeli perspectives. And again, this is all quoted by Avi Shlaim, so you can, of course, use anything written here as a quote in your essay. You can chop it up and use it as a quote in an essay. So, the conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine came to a head following the passage on the 29th of November 1947 of the United Nations Partition Resolution, which called for the establishment of two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jews accepted the UN plan despite the painful sacrifices it entailed, but the Palestinians, the neighboring Arab states, and the Arab League rejected it. So the partition plan basically said that the Jews can have part of the land and the Arabs can have part of the land. The Jews were like, yeah, of course, we'll accept this, but the Arabs were like, absolutely not. We want all the land. It's our land. We need it, all of it. The Jews have none of it. So, with the expiry of the British Mandate and the proclamation of the State of Israel, 7 Arab states sent their armies into Palestine with the firm intention of strangling the Jewish state at birth. Now remember, these are the Israeli perspectives. This does not mean that the Arabs' army's intention was actually to strangle the Jewish state at birth. It might have been, but this is the perception of the Israelis. This is what the Israelis believe to be true. And of course, it is heavily, or historians today believe that it's heavily biased. But you just need to keep that in mind. I'm not saying the history is wrong, but it's just something you need to keep in mind because this topic is heavily based around who believed what, when, why, and how. Like it's pretty crazy. But just keep that in mind. So, the subsequent struggle was an unequal one between a Jewish David and an Arab Goliath. So basically what this means is that the Israelis' perspective or the Israelis' sort of documentation of this war was basically that there was a Jewish David, which means it was sort of like a David and Goliath situation whereby the Jews were David and the Arabs were Goliath. And so basically this means that the Jews sort of succumb all odds. Basically, the Jews had a really small army. They really didn't have the same technology, modern warfare as the Arabs did. Again, this is what the Jews believed. Whereas the Arabs had sort of, these huge armies, these really great weapons, great technology. And so it was sort of like we won against all odds. This is what the Jews believe. They believe that they won the war against all odds. The Arabs should have won because, looking at the facts and the sheer numbers of their armies, according to the Jews, according to the Israelis, the Arabs should have won, but the Jews succumbed all odds and they were able to pull through and win the war. Now, the infant Jewish state for a desperate, heroic, and ultimately successful battle for survival against overwhelming odds. So again, this is what I was just explaining about how this sort of Jewish David and Arab Goliath thing played out. Moving on, Palestinian perspectives. Now, these are quoted by Salman Mesalha. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. But he is a sort of journalist. So he's not exactly a historian. He's a history journalist. But everything here is quoted by him. He said all these things in an article from the Haaretz website. And the article is entitled The 1948 War Through Arab Eyes. And it's like literally right next to the title is the word opinion. So again, this is his Palestinian or this is his Arab opinion of the 1948 war. So Husseini compares the establishment of a Jewish state, even in a small part of Palestine, to a rotten orange that would spoil all oranges in the crate. Now, of course, this is sort of an analogy or a metaphor by Husseini, who his full name is actually Jamal al-Husseini, and he was sort of like a person who recounted the war from an Arab perspective. Now, of course, just from that, you can tell that the Arabs really didn't want the Jews to have their own state. And so, of course, the moment that they did get their state at the end of the British Mandate, the Arabs were like, hell no, we're coming in and we are taking this from you. So, anything over here, as you can see in these notes when you guys are watching over these videos, these blue sort of bluish beige highlighted things, these are all quotes, and these are like historian quotes that I think are worth sort of maybe not remembering, but they're definitely worth keeping in mind and just knowing. So in this quote also it says Ryle. This should say rule. I don't know why it says Ryle, but we'll say rule. The quote actually reads rule. So, the declaration about the establishment of two states, Arab and Jewish, is a proposal that is unacceptable to the Arabs. The only practical solution is the establishment of a state under Arab rule in which the Jews will be a minority. And this is from historian Palestinian. Actually, I don't believe he's a historian. I will just double check this. Okay, so Palestine actually isn't a historian. This can almost be regarded as a primary account of the events that happened sort of pre-war, the perspectives pre-war in 1947. And he actually held the position of the General Secretary of the Arab League. And so he expressed these sort of angers. And of course, this is a first-hand account from the Arabs, and this can be used in an essay. Reading over here now. The defeat of the Arabs in Palestine is not a small downfall, it is a catastrophe, and that is from Dr. Zurich. And now this sort of touches base on the Arab perspective of the war being Nakba, and so this is a key term that you'd want to use in your essays, spelled Nakba, and it basically directly translates into English as the catastrophe. And this is what they referred to the war as. They referred to it as Nakba or Al-Nakba, and basically this is what they called the 1948 war. It was a catastrophe for the Arabs. Now, the Arabs believed that they had a birthright to Palestine, and hence they were trying to gain back their rightful land from the Jews, from the Israelis. And so this is something to also keep in mind. Again, as I said before, both the Jews and the Arabs believe they have a birthright to the land. And so it's almost as though the Arabs believed, this is our land. They've been given it through the British Mandate, but this is not their land. This is our land. We have a birthright to this land. And so they were going and they sort of, from their perspective, they were doing the right thing by themselves. They were not doing anything unjust. From their perspective, they were doing everything by what they should be doing, really. Note here that Avi Shlaim has mentioned the difficulty for post-Zionist historians to gather evidence on the perspectives of Arabs for the war of 1948. He quotes that on the 1948 war, little access is allowed to relevant Arab archives, posing a serious problem for the researcher. No definitive account of the 1948 war can be concluded undoubtedly. And whether you want to use this quote in relation to the 1948 war, or whether you want to actually use this quote to argue the fact that none of this history can be concluded undoubtedly, is really up to you. You can use this quote in any way you like, but really, this quote sort of applies for the whole modern history topic of the conflict of the Arab-Israeli war. The conflict between the Arabs and Israelis. This point applies everywhere. This is such a key quote from Avi Shlaim, and I actually found it through my research, and I would really highly recommend keeping this quote. This quote is again from the article that I mentioned from Avi Shlaim earlier, which is called The Debate About 1948. This is something really important, and I'm going to keep emphasizing it. This is such an important quote, and I would really, really remember this one for my essays. If you want to make any argument that something may be doubtable, you can quote this from Avi Shlaim. Now, let's look at the post-Zionist views. These are all of Avi Shlaim's views. He is a post-Zionist. We can use him as our source. And so he does quote from other post-Zionists in his piece, The Debate About the 1948 War. And so this is sort of a holistic post-Zionist view. It's not just Avi Shlaim's opinion. It's sort of like what's been accepted by the post-Zionists, which are sort of like the best account of this history that we can currently get. So, post-Zionist uncover in the Zionist or Israeli perceptions of the 1948 war is furthest from the truth, as the Israeli armies actually outnumbered the Arab forces in Palestine. So, what he's saying here is that the Zionist view, where, the whole Jewish David, Arab Goliath situation, is really far from the truth, because the Arab armies were actually outnumbered by the Palestinian armies. And so this whole David and Goliath thing is, according to the post-Zionists, really furthest from the truth. Avi Shlaim also quotes that Israeli forces outnumbered the Arabs more than 2-1. This means there was double the Palestinian army. There was double the Israeli army than there was the Palestinian army. So this David and Goliath situation can be argued completely, doubtable. It's completely doubtable. Avi Shlaim goes on. I'm so sorry for the spelling mistakes. I typed all of these notes through voice typing, and so of course voice typing is bound to screw up somehow, but we'll move on from that. So what propagated the myth that Israel won miraculously was her population of 700,000 when compared to the combined Arab population of 40 million. Now, that's insane. 700,000 compared to 40 million, that's over 42 times bigger. The Arab population is over 42 times bigger than the Israel population. And so this concludes our look at the very first dot point in the syllabus, entitled Israeli and Palestinian Perspectives on the 1948 Arab War. We've discussed all the perspectives of post-Zionists, Zionists, and Arabs. We've looked at what the Arabs believe, what the Jews believe, what the actual current historical views align with. And so now what we will do is, in the next lesson, I will be discussing the next subpoint, which is this one right here, which is the 1967 consequences of war for Israel and Palestine. So come to the next lesson and we will learn about that. Goodbye.